Hello and welcome to Nobel Minds with me, Zeinab Badawi. I'm in the King's Library in the Royal Palace in Stockholm, Sweden, surrounded by thousands of books containing the accumulated knowledge from down the centuries. We're here to meet and celebrate some of the great scientific minds of today, brought together for the first time on TV. Their research and discoveries are helping to make the world a better place. Is that what defines good science? I'll be asking the Nobel 2012 laureates if science only matters if it has practical applications. And with me are 7 of this year's Nobel Prize winners. Dave Wineland and Serge Haroche, who won the prize for physics. Al Roth, one of the 2 prize winners for economics. Sir John Gurdon and Shinya Yamanaka won the prize for medicine or physiology. And Bob Lefkowitz and Brian Kabilka, who won the prize for chemistry. Gentlemen, welcome to you all, and of course, congratulations. So you're all now celebrated great scientists. The world has acknowledged that. John Gurdon didn't start off like that for you, I have to say. I mean, I've got a little bit from your school report when you were 15 and at Eton. Can I just remind you of what to say?
Yes,
Sorry to bring up old memories, but anyway, your teacher said, your report was disastrous. I believe he has ideas of becoming a scientist. On his present showing, this is quite ridiculous. Your scientific ambitions are a waste of time. Now,
Yes.
I believe you came, what was it, 250 out of 250 in science?
Yes, I was the worst out of 250.
Right. Bottom of the class, in other words. But
Bottom of the class.
how that teacher got it wrong, right?
Well, are we sure? Maybe.
Well, you've won the Nobel Prize for medicine, so...
You don't know how many times I've done experiments that don't work. So,
You've got a copy of that report in your lab, have you?
I do, yes, to remind oneself when the experiments don't work that maybe he had a point.
But I mean, it does show you, doesn't it, that early work at school and so on isn't necessarily an indicator of later success.
But I'm a total non-intellectual, you see. I hate reading, feel uncomfortable. All these books around the place, it makes me feel quite uneasy. I don't read books if I can possibly help it, so I'm really a total non-intellectual.
Dave Wineland, you won the prize for physics. I ask all of you, what were you like at school? Because I think, actually, you were less interested in science, more interested in motorbikes and fast cars, weren't you?
Well, I kept my grades up in high school, but my friends and I were certainly, every spare minute was spent on motorcycles and cars, so that was my real interest at that time.
Shinya Yamanaka, you actually trained to become a medical doctor. You're an orthopaedic surgeon, because your father really wanted you to become an orthopaedic surgeon, but a doctor. But you say you weren't a very good orthopaedic surgeon. You say what took some people 15 minutes to do would take you 3 times as long.
Yeah, you're right. I started my career as an orthopedic surgeon 25 years ago, and I thought I would be a talented surgeon, but it turned out I'm not talented at all. So only after a few years I gave up, and I became a scientist.
Anybody else got stories of early failures? What about you, Bob? Were you just a AAA student all the way through?
Well, to be honest, I was a very good student and applied...
All right, we've had all the modesty, so now here we go.
And I did apply myself to my studies and generally did well. Interestingly, I went to a special public high school in New York City. It was not a private school. It was called the Bronx High School of Science. Admission was by an examination, which all junior high school students took, and the top grades were admitted to the school. And I learned in the past month or two that I'm the 8th graduate of this school to win the Nobel Prize. All 7 previous winners were in physics. And this is more than most countries have, actually.
So you've been waiting quite a while. Have you been itching to win a Nobel Prize?
I can't say I've been waiting for that, no. But it's nice to join my colleagues from this school.
Yeah, well, Serge Haroche, I mean, you are now at the Collège de France, very venerable institution, science institution, been around since, what, the 1530s.
Yes.
But what about you? Were you very good at school?
Yes, now that you said it, I can say it too. I was good at school too. But I like math, but also I liked history and other topics. And I'm very impressed to be in this room because I think that Descartes, who was invited by the Queen of Sweden, died from cold in this palace in the 17th century. So things have improved now. We are not that cold today.
Frenchmen are very welcome here.
But I think for a Cartesian mind, it's very interesting to be in this place now.
What about you, Al? What were you like at school?
Well, I think in retrospect, I was an ungrateful student, so I didn't appreciate all that was done for me in high school, and I never finished high school. But I did, you should emphasize to your listeners who are in high school, I didn't drop out of education. I went to college.
But you didn't finish high school?
No.
God, we're learning an awful lot about you Nobel Prize winners, aren't you? You know, disastrous school reports, didn't finish high school, but you went on to further education.
I did. So I'm a big fan of education, but I wasn't a big fan of high school.
So what, you took a break and then went to university later?
A short break, and I ended up going to university earlier than I would have otherwise.
Oh, so you were a kind of child prodigy then?
I was young. It was a long time ago.
Oh, I see. Can't quite get it. So not a high school dropout, but just went to university early. Oh, right. So I think actually that sounds like a very brilliant person. Brian Kabilka, you won the prize for chemistry.
Yeah, I'm afraid I wasn't very interesting as a child. I had a pretty normal grade school and high school career. I was a good student. I wasn't the best student. I would have to say, though, that I was the first, I believe, Nobel laureate out of Little Falls Senior High School, so I'm very proud of that.
But you're now all good scientists, and Al Roth, I know some people say economics isn't really a science, but I know that you think it is because, interesting enough, actually you and your fellow recipient, Lloyd Shapley, who couldn't be at this discussion with us, neither of you actually have taken a class in economics. You trained as an engineer and also read applied physics. He studied mathematics. Applied mathematics, beg your pardon. He also studied mathematics and says, I've never taken an economics class in my life. So we kind of include you in the scientists. But you're all good scientists, but what makes good science? Is it the pure science, that basic research, or is it what's called translational research, research which actually ends with some kind of product, whether it's a drug or something tangible like the transistor radio. On that, John Gurdon, what about you?
Well, I would think the one answer to that question would be curiosity, as a matter of fact. If you find something you really want to understand, know about, that would surely be a really driving force. And of course, if it turns out to be useful, so much the better. But I think one is, at least in my case, primarily motivated by wanting to answer a question. You're curious about something, and so you keep on until you hope, finally, to have answered the question that attracts your interest.
So it doesn't matter if you don't know what the end result is at all.
To me,
you
not.
Just to be curious.
And if it turns out to be useful and later on, so much the better. But you think it would be mainly driven by curiosity rather than some commercial or therapeutic benefit, which, of course, might or might not work out.
I mean, Al Roth, do you agree with that?
Well, I think you'd be hard-pressed to be sure that any scientific advance would be forever useless. When you look at the course of human history, there's enormous increase in material prosperity that comes from all sorts of directions. All sorts of knowledge has proved to be quite useful. We were talking this morning about cryptography. Serge mentioned that he'd just been at a prize ceremony for a cryptographer. When I was young, number theory was one of the most unapplied branches of mathematics, but today it's the basis of cryptography. So it's very hard to guess what knowledge will not be useful.
But interesting enough, you won the economics prize along with Lloyd Shapley for testing your theories in the real world. Very practical application to your theories. You awarded the prize for how to fairly and efficiently match people with things when pricing is not the main factor or not relevant at all. For instance, when you try to find kidney transplant recipients with the donors, or employers with employees, or schools with students. And Lloyd Shapley did some rather groundbreaking research in the early 60s with the late David Gale called the marriage model, which looked at how people actually find their marriage partners.
Well, so that's
through a series of mathematical propositions, wasn't it?
Well, so not quite. So my work is I have sort of an engineering inclination, so my work is motivated by very applied questions. But David and Lloyd, what they did in their 1962 paper was use marriage as a metaphor, and they were really doing something that certainly Lloyd regards as pure mathematics. It was a sort of what we call a toy problem, but it was a toy problem that when we started to see similar events occurring in markets allowed us to understand them because we already had practice understanding them in this abstract mathematical world. So I think some of Lloyd's work, not just the 1962 paper with David, but his 1974 paper where they talked about a housing market with no money. Of course, we don't sell houses with no money, but it was a practice exercise.
But we all like the marriage model, though. I mean, you're saying they did look at which couples could marry each other and stay the most happily together.
They had a mathematical model in which they called it marriage, but they weren't investigating actual marriages. So theirs wasn't an empirical study.
What about you, Brian Kabilka? And because you won the prize along with Bob Lefkowitz for chemistry for the study of cells, and each cell has tiny receptors that enable it to sense its environment so that it can adapt, and it revealed the inner workings of an important family of such receptors, the G protein coupled receptors, or GPCRs. And that's going to really improve our understanding of how better to develop drugs, and also drugs with fewer side effects. So there is a very, very clear practical benefit from your research, isn't there? And that surely must make you quite content.
It does.
Nice side effect.
It is, and it certainly helps when trying to describe to people what we do. It helps to make it more tangible to them, the fact that it is important, that our outcome, that the results of our research might have a real therapeutic outcome. However, I again have to emphasize that really wasn't the major driving force. I think when I started in Bob's lab, what we were thinking of were little blocks on a sheet of paper, one representing the receptor, one representing a G protein, and a little smaller block representing the hormone. And I really wanted to know structurally what they looked like and the details of how they actually interacted with each other, and that was the driving force for me.
Dave Wineland, because you won the physics prize along with Serge Arosh, and what you did was inventing and developing methods for measuring and manipulating individual particles according to the rule of quantum physics in ways previously not thought possible. And there is really a very clear application to your work: atomic clocks, GPS, global positioning satellites, and MRI scans, and the cell phone even. I mean, what would we do without that? So again, was that important to you, the fact that there are these very clear benefits, or like Brian, was it not the prime motivator?
Well, I think I'd say I have a mixed, reaction to this question, in that I think I'm also driven by curiosity. I mean, that's the main thing I think that keeps us going. But my job at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, one of our group's main function is to try to make better clocks. But I'd say that's only a springboard towards investigating a lot of interesting problems along the way. So having this goal, I don't think is so bad. I think what might be a problem is if we're restricted to only focus on a goal with a certain deadline and a certain...
Interesting. You're all fairly unanimous on that. But Alvin Roth, with economics, you look at the markets and, how they work efficiently and so on. All of you are saying you embarked on this research. It was just curiosity-driven. It took many, many years, decades sometimes. Would the market have backed these guys?
Well, the market backs them through universities and through national laboratories, right? So science is supported. We're prosperous societies partly because we support research at all stages, not just research and development, but basic research.
But do you think that if you look at it, funding is obviously under pressure in practically every country in the world? I mean, would John Gurdon's early experiments with frogs, which later, led to the pioneering work that you carried out and Shinya Yamanaka built on, how you can reverse adult cells to embryonic cells, from which all sorts of other cells can be made. Many years later, led to the work that brought us the successful cloning of Dolly the sheep. I mean, in those early stages, when John Gurdon was sitting there with his laboratories, his experiments that he says that didn't work, would the market have backed him?
Well, the market did back him. He did do those
Do you think
experiments.
it would...
It wasn't pharmaceutical companies that backed him, but we
right.
collectively, research is a public good, and we provide it like roads.
Would it back you now, do you think, John
I think
Gurdon?
it's a lot harder now.
Thank you, John, for helping me out there, you see.
Well, you don't need much help by the sounds of it, but actually, it is tough now. You usually have to say some way in which what you hope to do will be either good for health or for business, and I think it was a little bit easier then. It was easier to propose something which might well not work, and you're given the benefit of the doubt, given a try. If you work for 10 or 20 years and nothing happens, you're unlikely to get more support. Would I have got support if I now applied to do what I originally did? I think it's quite questionable.
Yes, I don't agree with the universal virtue of the market. I think the market put a lot of pressure on scientists now, and the market does not give enough value to priceless goods like curiosity-driven things. You really have now more and more to work on short-term projects and to project yourself in the future and to describe the milestones that you are going to reach. And this is contrary to what fundamental research is about. So I would have mixed feelings about the power of the market now on science.
Really? I mean, would you see things like the Bell Laboratories of the 1950s
yes.
that brought Nobel Prize after Nobel Prize?
Yeah, that's a good example. The Bell Labs from the 1950s to the 1970s were, I think, the most fruitful lab which ever existed. You had Nobel Prize after Nobel Prize in physics coming out from these labs. And this worked until the point where in the 1980s, the Bell Telephone Company lost the monopoly of the telecommunication. It was open to competition. And then the shareholders of Bell Labs, which became ATT, decided that it was not worthwhile to spend money on research because it did not give short-term returns. And these labs have been destroyed. They disappeared. And you still have posthumous Nobel Prize from the Bell Labs. 2 or 3 years ago, there was a Nobel Prize about the digital camera. It was a work done in the 70s in the Bell Labs, but the Bell Labs do not exist anymore in this form. And I think this is a typical example of things which have come from the deregulation of the market, which is bad for science.
This is a very current problem in biomedical research in the United States, where the major funder is the National Institutes of Health. And just as you say, Serge, the emphasis is on doing things which are not risky. Yeah. So to have a grant proposal funded, you have to propose something and then present in the grant application what's called preliminary data, which is basically evidence that you've already done what you're proposing to do. Okay? In other words, if there's any risk involved, then your proposal won't be funded. So the entire system tends to encourage not particularly creative research, relatively descriptive and incremental changes, incremental advances, which you're certain to make, but which won't really change things very much. Now, a very different model of funding is one which I have been able to profit from throughout my career, which is the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which, while not at the same level of funding as the National Institutes of Health, is still a big funder of research. There are now 350 investigators. But rather than funding projects, they fund investigators. So they fund me. They don't fund me to do a specific project, and I get 5 years of support. Every 5 years, I have to present sort of, it's mostly retrospective, what I did. I guess the idea being that the best predictor of future success is past success. And if I can convince them that I've been a good steward of the money they gave me, and I present some reasonable ideas for the future, I'm funded again.
So do you think money has had a bit of a corrupting or pernicious or negative impact on the work of scientists today?
Certainly not in academia. I don't think there's enough money.
There's not enough, but I mean, there's not enough money. So why don't you go into... there's a lot of money for commercial scientists, those who work in pharmaceutical companies or whatever, trying to develop a drug and so on. So when you see a fellow academic go to the commercial side? What do you say to them?
Well, I'm the one who made that statement about saying they've gone over to the dark side. But of course,
Why did you say that?
I guess I'm being somewhat facetious. I guess as a pure academic, I see the quest for basic knowledge as sort of perhaps the highest pursuit. But perhaps that's a bit arrogant of me.
So, I mean, do you all think that perhaps the pure science or the blue skies thinking emerges from the scientists at universities, and that, in a way, they are at the forefront more of the kind of science that delivers the Nobel Prize winners? John, you wanted to come in?
So I wanted to make a comment on this point you made about the organisations want to know what you're going to do and so on. The Wellcome Trust, who fund a lot of money in Britain, made a survey of of the consequences of research that they had funded. Did people answer the question that they said they were going to answer? The conclusion was that 80% of the work did not answer the question they started with, was nevertheless very interesting.
I think it's the same in physics. When the great discoveries were made, for instance, when the laser was invented, nobody knew what it would be useful for. You remember there was this famous James Bond movie in the beginning of the 1960s where you saw a laser which was cutting a piece of metal. So it was supposed to be the big use of lasers. And now, 50 years later, we find that the laser are useful for many other things, not that kind of thing, but in medicine, for CD and DVD players, for the global communication network with optical fibers carrying laser beams and so on. But this was not predicted at the beginning.
David Wineland, you are a government scientist, really, because you work principally at the National Institute for Standards and Technology. What is it like being a government scientist? I mean, are you subjected to the kind of pressures that commercial scientists have?
Actually, you know, our group doesn't work so much different than a university group. And, you know, I suppose we're somewhat restricted. I think if we started work on ESP or something like that, that we might get some notices from our bosses. But no, I think one thing, I feel very fortunate that I think our management, my boss and my boss's boss, have always been very supportive of the idea that we can try new things and at the edge of, you know, the frontiers of science. And in fact, some of these things have turned out to be very useful in terms of practical application, particularly, for example, for clocks.
Shinya Yamanaka and Brian Kabilka, I mean, what are your thoughts on this about how commercial scientists and academic university scientists work? And also, you know, how do you protect your intellectual property?
You know, I belong to Kyoto University. It's a public university in Japan. And for the last 5 years, we have been spending a lot of our time and effort to secure our intellectual property on our technology, IPSO technologies. But the purpose for doing that was not to monopoly the technology. It's the opposite. We want to avoid the monopoly of the technology. We want to make the technology available for everybody. In order to achieve that, we need to secure our intellectual property.
Brian, in the United States?
I would say that my lab has had interactions with companies over the past several years that have been very beneficial for our research. Companies, particularly pharmaceutical companies, have chemicals, compounds that have helped us to get some of the crystal structures we've obtained. But it's often difficult to interact with companies because of issues of intellectual property, and it's been challenging to obtain certain compounds from companies because the company's lawyers and the university lawyers have to agree on what the ground rules are before the exchange can happen. But nevertheless, it's been important for our research.
But now, when it comes to going to that point of sharing knowledge and so on, I mean, you, Brian, have been collaborating with Bob for many, many years, you know, Duke University, Stanford University, but now your exchanges are virtually, really should be declared and almost monitored. I mean, the lawyers are coming in more and more, aren't they, into how you share information?
I think less it's much less so. Brian and I have been collaborating over the last several years, and I think that's pretty free exchange of communication. It's when we begin to collaborate or work with commercial entities that the lawyers descend en masse, and in my view, put a significant brake on the free exchange of information.
In my case, I never had problems with the lawyers in science, but from what has just been said by Brian and Bob, I want to emphasize that when the money comes from commercial industries, there are very often strings attached, and this it will be good if private money could fund curiosity-driven research more, because we are at a time where science has to answer fundamental questions put to humankind and society, questions about climate change, about health, about new sources of energy, and this will come first of all from basic research. So you have the public, the governments have to fund this research, because this will not come from even if there are exceptions, this will not come from private money.
Okay, but if money comes more, as you say, Serge Haroche, from the government, from the public sector, that's going to raise the public and the government's expectations of what the scientists can deliver. And I want to put to you that recent example we saw in October, where 6 scientists in Italy, along with 1 public official, were given 6-year jail sentences for failing to predict the extent of the risk of the earthquake in L'Aquila in 2009. And as you know, the Royal Society in the UK and also the National Academy of Sciences in America and also the Japanese scientists protested, and in France too, protested about the fact that this was going to inhibit scientists from making forecasts or predictions, and it was going to be an inhibitory factor. So won't it raise expectations of what scientists can deliver if they do get such public backing?
Yeah, I think in that case it was already. I think the decision made by this court, it was ridiculous, because it's a matter of defining probabilities, and the expectation of society is that you can live in a zero-risk society is something which is of course bad, and which would prevent scientists to give any opinion. So I think it was obviously a wrong decision. I think it's a kind of extreme situation, but I agree that if money is coming from the public sector, it means that we have to also to deliver and to show that that science is good for society and for humankind in general. And for that, I think the general public should be more aware of these problems, and the media have a lot of a big role to play in this field, to show that science is important, to present to the general public what science is about. I think, at least in France, I think the culture of the science culture is much less developed than the culture in humanities. A lot of people can almost brag that they don't understand anything about physics. Nobody would brag that he never reads a book, in spite of what he said.
But Alvin Roth, I mean, I don't want to make light of the plight of the scientists in Italy, but economists get their forecasts wrong all the time. Should they be held responsible for that?
Well, I think it's a misunderstanding of what scientists do. Certainly in economics, we're a very early science, right? There's lots to be learned about economics that 21st century economics will seem to our grandchildren to have been very primitive. But of course, you don't make progress in science without starting somewhere. So, markets are very hard to forecast.
What would happen if we tried to hold economists responsible for their wrong forecasts?
You would have very few economists.
Or a few who might be given prison sentences.
There you go. That would cut down the interest in economics among students.
Like I said, I don't want to make light of the scientists in Italy, but what do you all think about that, about what the general public and governments can expect of scientists, the role of science?
I think it's important to, that people realize that we need to take the long view. That is, that we can't expect results on a certain timetable. So I think it's important that we try to tell people that it's, you have to take the long view. There can be long periods without success, but In the end,
Yeah, I think
Bob Lefkowitz?
Yeah, I think the public has to understand that, at least in the biomedical area, I mean, ultimately the cures to diseases, cancer, which are going to come from fundamental research, which is going to take a long period of time, and much of which is not going to be specifically directed at finding a cure for cancer. It's going to be trying to understand how the genetics of cancer occur, what pathways are driven which lead to cancers, et cetera. This is going to take years, and it's going to take a sustained investment. Everybody wants the same outcome, but they've got to be willing to put the money in to pay for it.
I want to get a picture from Shinya Yamanaka about Japan and what the general public's expectations are there about scientists and the road of science and society.
Japan, right now, many people, lay people, they have lost trust in science and scientists, very unfortunately, because of the disaster in Fukushima. So all the scientists in the field in Japan kept saying, well, nuclear energy is safe, it is free from any risks. But it turned out it's not the case. We learned that in a very hard way. So they do not trust us anymore. So what can we do now as a scientist? We're very in a tough position. So I think what we should do is to be honest as possible. We should be 100% transparent to lay people in words which can be understood by lay people.
So do you think scientists like the ones in Italy should be held responsible when they get it wrong?
Well, it's really a tough question. You know, nobody knows the right answer. You know, we can't predict something.
But you just said nuclear scientists in Japan got it wrong.
In this case, I think the message was wrong. You know, we cannot say any new scientific technology is free from any risks. We can never say that. But unfortunately, the message about nuclear energy was something like that. People thought it's safe, no risks at all.
I want also to come back to what one thing that Dave said about the fact that research needs a long term. And unfortunately, politics is a short-term business. Politicians are re-elected in democracies every 2 years or 4 years, and they cannot have the long-term view, because if they support things which might be not popular on the short term, they will just lose the election. So it's very difficult for them to understand that you have to, for instance, to answer a question like the global warming, the effects will take 20 years, 30 years, and the solution will take that time. And if they don't, and if they try to understand that and to do things going in that direction, their electors will not elect them. So I think the public has to be aware of the fact that there are long-term issues.
John Gurdon?
I think one concern is that the scientists are expected to give definite answers. And let me give you the analogy of weather forecast. So weather forecasters are often criticized if they say it's going to rain and in fact it snows. The fact is they're much better off with a forecast than with no forecast. So people shouldn't blame these people for getting it not exactly right. They should be grateful for what they do.
And on the point that Serge was making about the short term and the long term, when you look at your early experiments with frogs and looking at stem cells, I mean, now people are working on your discoveries and research to try to reverse the progress of illnesses like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diabetes type 1, poor vision. And if you had taken that short-term view with your work, I mean, decades later, we're still waiting for those drugs. That wouldn't be the right way to go about things, would it?
Yes, you need to be prepared to accept benefits in the long term. I think that's absolutely right. And the only problem is, as I was saying earlier, if an organization that gives money says they want an answer to the very question they asked a short time afterwards, that's extremely difficult and would be quite inhibitory.
I think, you know, the problem is you can't put breakthroughs on a schedule. It just doesn't work that way, you know. Sometimes they come quickly and sometimes they take a very long time. So I think...
Looking at the physics prize that you won along with Serge Haroche, and when you look at the discipline of physics, I mean, are there more new frontiers in physics, or is it a subject with a great past behind it and perhaps less of a great future? Or how would you see it, I mean, in terms of the knowledge that has to be uncovered?
No, I think there is a lot of things which are not yet known in physics. And in astrophysics, for instance, there are big mysteries about the missing mass of the universe. There are also, it's not known how gravitation will fit in the picture of quantum physics. And so there are some unifications which are still lacking, and links between microscopic physics and cosmology are very interesting. You learn from the micro world the way the universe behaved at the beginning, and you have to learn, but this is something which is purely curiosity driven. Now, in the term of the physics that we are doing, which may have some application in the future, it is also very difficult to predict what will be the outcome, but certainly there will be some unforeseen discoveries coming from what we are doing. In the last 50 years, the physics has improved by many orders of magnitude in all kinds of directions. In all these areas, physics has evolved very fast. And one question you may ask, will it go on this kind of exponential growth? And at some point we'll have to find other questions, for instance, to try to build complexity out of these systems. And the quantum computer is one possibility, but there are many others.
I always remember Pythagoras gave us a triangle theorem, and because of the beauty of triangles, captured his imagination. But eventually it gave us the instrument, didn't it, which made it possible for rockets to fly. So that really was the long view there. But looking at chemistry, do you think that there are really massive new frontiers to be explored, or are you getting to reach a plateau more?
Well, I think as we've all learned, one of the things that comes with the Nobel Prize is the expectation that one can pontificate on all manner of subjects well beyond one's competence, and that one can assume the role of a visionary. And I'm still learning how to do that. And some would even question whether Brian and I are chemists. I think that there are always bold new frontiers in all fields of science. I think in biochemistry and biomedical science, just to throw out two areas that I think are fascinating, one would be in neurobiology. There's a whole field of molecular neurobiology, and certainly one of the cross currents in my and Brian's research, there's certainly impact on that, because neurological systems function around receptors and neurotransmitters. But the basis of what's called mind, cognition, consciousness, how does that work? I mean, at a neurobiological level, completely unknown.
Physiology, medicine? Lots more to uncover there.
Can I make a comment in relation to that? And Shinya Yamanaka is better qualified than me to make it, but let me at least start. And that is that this whole area that very much arises from the work he's done of cell replacement is, I think, showing real promise in the next year or two. So there's a disorder called age-related macular degeneration, by which people lose their ability to see, lose vision progressively, and eventually lose all vision. It's now possible to introduce replacement cells behind the eye, and this can give some quite significant restoration of vision. And this whole area then of cell replacement is looking very positive from that particular point of view. So I would see that as an example of where something is happening on a great deal shorter time scale than you're indicating.
Good. And Al Roth, economics is a relative newcomer, isn't it, in this regard? And you yourself said there's a great deal more to uncover when it comes to economics. And why do you say that?
Well, you know, economics is, we study a set of human interactions. Economics is like language. It's one of the things that people do. People have been doing it since the beginning of time, but we're only learning now how to study it well. And some of the things that the public, if you like, the media expects us to study are not the things that we are closest to understanding. It's a little bit like asking doctors why they haven't solved the problem of death. There's lots of progress in medicine, but it's not close to solving the problem
It's
of
a
death.
very interdisciplinary approach that you need in economics, really, isn't it? You've got to know a bit about how households and firms behave, and that goes into the realm of psychology almost at
You know,
times.
economics is a very broad subject, much the way that perhaps biology is combined with medicine, right? There's a great deal of knowledge that goes on around this table about all the things that go into life. And similarly in economics, it studies very mundane things like how you make pencils, but it also studies very complicated and poorly understood things like how the larger economy moves. So we'll slowly make progress, and certainly it'll be part of our job to communicate what we're doing to the public.
Oh, sure, that's always welcome. But do you all feel that you've obviously got great scientific minds, and do you feel that perhaps the wider public should have a bit more scientific training? Everybody should have some kind of science under their belt, and that it's not good to be ignorant in this realm, and that we'd all be better off if we had a bit of scientific training?
You know, in the United States, there is actually a current of sort of anti-science and anti-intellectualism. I'm not saying that's a majority view, but it's a minority view. But, you know, the whole issue of creationism, denial of evolution as a proper concept, denial of global warming.
But there's a lot of money, research, going into science, nevertheless, in the United States.
Indeed,
yeah.
Indeed. But I guess the issue is what's an appropriate level of scientific literacy for the population at large? How much science should be taught in high schools?
Do we need more?
Do we need more?
Yeah.
Do we? You think we do? Bob Lefkowitz?
yeah.
You think we do?
I think we do, yes.
Yeah, I think too. I think the problems that we have to solve have to be exposed clearly. And science, one part of science is to ask questions. So you have to find what is the question, what are the conditions you want to answer the question, and if you give this kind of mind orientation to people at large, maybe they will understand, and it will have an effect on politics and on the people who represent the public. And this would be very important to achieve things. But I'm very optimistic, I think, when I say that.
Who thinks that having scientific training where you have evidence-based theories and so on would make the world a better place? Would the world be a better place if it were run by scientists?
Well, there's a difference between having it run by scientists and having more scientific knowledge among people who buy it, and also more scientists, even if not all politicians should be scientists. So for instance, the Secretary of Energy of the United States is a Nobel laureate in physics, and by all accounts, he's doing a very good job. And for Secretary of Energy, that's probably an area where it's particularly valuable to have a scientist.
But just in general, Brian, I mean, I know it sounds a bit, but, you know, should we bring science into, first of all, the sort of, you know, general scientific literacy, something that's desirable, and would the world be better if politicians did have a bit more scientific background or basis?
Well, I think everybody would benefit from knowing more about everything. And in the curriculum of, for example, high schools and colleges, it's perhaps not so much spending more time on science, but being more effective in how you spend the time you have to teach. And I think if everybody in Congress had a better background in science, and I believe that it would benefit legislation.
Shinya Yamanaka?
Well, as a scientist, I really love serendipity. I really love unexpected results. But for politicians, I don't think that's good. So at least myself, I wouldn't be a good politician.
Dave?
I don't know whether we need trained scientists in government and politics, but I think more just there needs to be an appreciation just for how science works. And we've been talking about this a bit, that you can't predict the future, and that, you know, scientists work often on probabilities of events. And so this incident in Italy, I think, is a lack of appreciation that there can only be predictions about probabilities of events. And so I think it's more, not that people have to be experts in science to be effective politicians, but they at least have appreciation for how science works.
John Gurdon, do you want...
So I think one point that hasn't emerged is the prospects of employment. If you train a lot of people to be scientists, quite often they might expect, or at least hope, to have a job that makes some use of their training. Now, if you take a course in arts or literature or something, you can expect to get employment in a whole range of things. And I know a number of people who say, I'm not going to go into science or engineering because I'm worried about getting a job, worried about getting grants and employment and so on. So it's unfortunate that I think is putting some people off, even though actually scientists are just as good at most other kinds of jobs as non-scientists.
So would you like to see more scientists in power?
I think I would, because they have a very a good quantitative view of everything. All the decisions they take are better taken on quantitative basis than otherwise.
All right, well, John Gurdon clearly wanting us to reach out for those science books again. So if today's leaders understood a bit more about science, would that necessarily make them better leaders? Who knows? I'll leave that thought with you, our audience, wherever you are. I thank our Nobel laureates for sharing their insights and wisdom with us, and congratulations again to all of you. From me, Zeinab Badawi, here at the magnificent King's Library in the Royal Palace in Stockholm, Sweden. Nobel Minds 2012. Goodbye.